do an equation here using a vulnerability stress model, which I'm also linking below for you to learn more about. Let's say a child has biological predeterminants such as increased cortisol production or low hippocampal neurogenesis, as detailed more fully in this article right here on the HPA axis being responsible for the release of glucocorticoid stress hormones. And neurobiology is not my main focus of psychology. I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum, looking more at spiritual psychology. Those are very important elements, and I always put links in the description on the neurobiological basis of psychology, because spiritual psychology doesn't mean doing away with biology and empirical science, right? It just means broadening, elevating our understanding of psychology from not just those constraints, but biology, sociology, social aspects, and then metaphysics as well. That child is also living in an urban environment which magnifies their sensitivity to stress. I'm showing this great episode from the show Seinfeld, which I grew up in New York and I used to watch that show all the time, and you can say that so much of the craziness which happens in that show, or even a show like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, is because of they live in this city environment, right?
It's authentic, and that's what I want. That's what I'm going for. An authentic Irish... Get fucked! Oh.
Them living in a city environment, this hypothetical child, makes them more susceptible to trauma as well, such as their risk for abuse magnifies as a function of being around so many people, right? Both familial and non-familial adults, or even peers, right? Lots of abuse happens through like second cousins or just lack of supervision. We know from a plethora of research that physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse has a direct, significant increase in psychosis and psychotic disorders, not to mention other aspects such as clinical depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, as detailed in Dr. Matei's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which I just finished reading right here. I'm also linking it in the description. We also have multiple other social triggers which may be unique for certain populations. Some of the research that I've been doing, for example, immigration can also be a risk factor which leads to schizophrenia, particularly when the person, the immigrant, moves to a community or even country with low ethnic identification. This is a really interesting article from Queen's University. I'm going to directly quote an excerpt from the article, but I would strongly recommend reading the full article, as it separates immigrants moving to nations with long-standing immigration, such as the United States, and immigrants moving to nations with newly immigrated policies, such as Denmark, and then comparing percentages to immigrants from their countries of origin. So here's the quote from the article. Both black and non-black immigrants have a higher risk than do native-born subjects for schizophrenia, manic, depressive, and other psychoses and affective psychoses. The second-generation immigrants remain at higher risk. This increased risk is linked to immigrant status, independent of skin color. It is hypothesized that epigenetic mechanisms are activated by a yet unknown trigger, stress, change in diet, or something else, and are involved in the genesis of psychotic episodes observed in schizophrenia and other psychoses. Epigenetics refer to modifications in gene expression controlled by heritable but potentially reversible changes in DNA methylation and or chromatin structure. The book Suspicious Minds uses the example of abuse to illustrate epigenetics through a study in which post-mortem tissue from the brains of 3 groups of young adults were examined. Ones who had committed suicide, and all of these young men were around the same age, young men who had committed suicide and had a significant history of abuse as children and as teenagers, ones who had committed suicide but did not have a history of significant persistent abuse, and young men, that is, who had died in car accidents and did not have any history of abuse. The first group showed significant epigenetic changes. That is, they had different chemical patterns and makeups in their DNA as opposed to the other 2 groups. And I am putting more information on epigenetics because we are only scratching the surface on how it intertwines with our life experiences and most importantly, how it shifts our approach to mental health as active facilitators. We can literally rewire our biochemistry and our psychology through the decisions we make, not just for ourselves, but also for how we treat others, and most of us live in metropolitan areas. That also means how we treat strangers as well, right? As always, I put links in the description for individuals to learn more about mindfulness and spirituality. That's my main research area. It's the main focus of the psychological work that I do, because there is a lot of change that we can make at an individual level. Let's watch this clip from a documentary to learn more about epigenetics. The full documentary is linked below in the description.
Epigenetics is a brand new science, and the important part is the prefix epi. Epi means above. Interestingly, skin is called epidermis. So epidermis means above the dermis. Well, now we're talking about epigenetics. Translated, epigenetic control simply means control above the genes. And now we recognize that the environment, and specifically our perception of the environment, is what controls our genes. Since we can control the environment, since we can control our perceptions, then we're not victims of our genetics, we are masters of our genetics.
So are all kids who live in an urban environment doomed to hell? I always talk about protective elements, and in this video that I'm putting right here, I talked about social cohesiveness, neighborhood solidarity, and enculturation, using the great Spike Lee film Do the Right Thing as an example, right? It's never so dichotomous. A child may have an increased risk of developing any disorder, schizophrenia or otherwise, due to genetics or low socioeconomic status, but it's never predetermined.
Come on, let's get up, come on. You're gonna be all right. You're gonna be all right, my boy. Eddie, you're gonna be just fine, okay?
A strengths-based approach or positive psychology, right? The lab that I work in, I'm linking our website in the description below. Our orientation, our framework is through a positive psychology framework. It helps us focus more deeply on how a child or any individual may be protected and even flourish in spite of or because of risk factors, so-called risk factors. Having a stable and loving household with both mother and father, or two parents that is, present is strong enough to reduce the likelihood of a mental illness from manifesting, as I detail extensively in my Do Fathers Matter video. Possibly the biggest protective factor for all individuals is stable, productive, and meaningful social relationships, both with family, peers, friends, mentors, and the larger community in which the individual is situated in. Let's use physiology to illustrate why this is the case. Animals which have larger neocortexes, such as in monkeys or apes or human beings, the larger a social group tends to be. This is a double-edged sword in that strong affiliative relationships with our social group provides a rich foundation for cooperation and coordination. The German psychoanalyst Karen Horney formulated this almost 100 years ago through the attachment theory in her book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. I just saw the film Megan last night, and it actually there's a therapist, a child therapist in that film, which talks about attachment theory to the main character to illustrate how artificial intelligence, that is Megan, this android doll, can replace parental functions. And it was a really good film also, so check that out. Going back even further, our spiritual philosophies implore the believer in this Islamic hadith: honor your family, for they are the wings with which you fly and the hands with which you fight. They are the home that you always return to.